December 18, 1942, Stalingrad Sector, Soviet Union. The German pilot in the Messerschmitt Bf 109 couldn't stop laughing when he saw it. An American P-39 Airacobra with the red star painted on its fuselage. He'd heard the jokes back at the airfield. The Americans had sent their garbage planes to the Russians, the ones even they wouldn't fly. The thing had its engine behind the pilot, for God's sake. Who builds a fighter plane backwards? He waggled his wings at his wingman, ready to add another easy kill to his tally. Then the P-39's nose lit up with a flash that looked wrong, too big for machine guns. The 37mm cannon shell punched through his engine block like it was made of paper. The Daimler-Benz engine that had carried him over Poland, France, and Britain seized instantly. Oil sprayed across his windscreen, black and thick. He had maybe 3 seconds to realize the Russians weren't laughing before the second shell tore his wing off. Lieutenant Ivan Kozhedub from the village outside Chernihiv had been flying the P-39 for 6 weeks. The Soviet Air Force called them Kobrushkas, little cobras. The Americans had essentially given them away through Lend-Lease, shipped them through Iran and Alaska in crates. Most American pilots hated them. Too heavy, engine in the wrong place, tendency to go into flat spins that killed experienced pilots. But Kozhedub had learned something the Americans hadn't figured out. If you flew the P-39 below 15,000 feet, if you used its weight instead of fighting it, if you trusted that massive cannon in the nose, it became something else entirely. A tank killer that could fly. The mechanic from Rostov who kept Kozhedub's plane running had explained it simply. The Americans built their planes to fight at 25,000 feet, doing escort duty for bombers over Germany. They needed superchargers, high-altitude performance, long range. The Eastern Front was different. Most air combat happened below 10,000 feet, sometimes at treetop level. Dogfights over tank battles. Strafing runs on supply columns. Close support for ground troops. The P-39's weaknesses at altitude meant nothing when you were flying 50 feet off the ground, hunting Tiger's tanks with a 37mm cannon that could punch through their top armor. By January 1943, the Germans had stopped laughing. The Luftwaffe pilots who'd cut their teeth in Spain, who'd pioneered blitzkrieg over Poland, who'd fought the Battle of Britain, were meeting Soviet pilots in American planes and losing. Not just losing, dying at rates that made replacement impossible. The P-39 couldn't outclimb a Bf 109, couldn't match it at altitude. But down in the weeds, where the fighting on the Eastern Front actually happened, it was deadly. That big cannon that made it nose-heavy, perfect for ground attack. The car-style door that American pilots mocked, Russian pilots loved it. Easier to bail out when things went wrong, and things always went wrong on the Eastern Front. Captain Alexander Pokryshkin from Novonikolayevsk had figured out the tactics. He'd been a factory worker before the war, understood machines, understood physics. The P-39 was heavy, nearly 8,000 pounds loaded. American doctrine said to climb, use altitude, dive on the enemy. Pokryshkin threw that away. Use the weight, he told his squadron. Come in low, come in fast. One pass with the cannon, don't dogfight. Let the Germans try their vertical maneuvers. While they're climbing, you're already gone, setting up another run. The 37mm only carried 30 rounds, but you only needed one good hit. He painted a formula on the side of his plane. Altitude equals speed, equals maneuver, equals fire. The Germans who saw it and lived started calling him the Siberian Tiger. The numbers told the story. In 1941, flying Soviet planes, the Red Air Force had been slaughtered. Kill ratios of 10-1 in Germany's favor. By mid-1943, with P-39s making up a significant part of their fighter force, Soviet pilots were holding their own. By 1944, they owned the sky below 15,000 feet. Of the top 10 Soviet aces, 6 flew P-39s as their primary aircraft. Pokryshkin shot down 59 German planes in his Kobrushka. Kozhedub got 62. These weren't propaganda numbers. The Soviets required witness confirmation. often from ground forces, sometimes from captured German pilots. The teacher from Kursk, Gregory Rechkalov, had been shot down twice in Soviet-built planes before getting his P-39 in March 1943. He was a terrible pilot by American standards, couldn't hold formation, hated flying above 10,000 feet, refused to follow tactical doctrine. In a P-39, none of that mattered. He hunted alone, stalking German transport planes at dawn, using clouds and the sun. The big cannon meant he didn't need to get close. 400 yards was killing range. By May, he had 12 kills. By July, 30. The Germans put a bounty on him specifically. Any pilot who shot down the P-39 with the White Eagle painted on its nose would get immediate leave and an Iron Cross. The P-39's engine placement that Americans cursed became a Russian advantage. The Allison V-1710 sat behind the pilot, connected to the propeller by a 10-foot drive shaft that ran under the cockpit. When American pilots heard about this design, they laughed. When they flew it, they complained about the center of gravity, the weird balance, the tendency to tumble. Russian pilots, many of whom had learned to fly an aircraft that barely qualified as planes, adapted immediately. The engine behind you meant better visibility forward, crucial for ground attack. It meant the nose could house that massive cannon without offset problems. It meant that when you did get hit, the engine block protected you from behind. Lieutenant Viktor Golubev from Leningrad learned this the hard way. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s jumped him over Kursk coming out of the sun. The first burst of cannon fire would have killed him in any other fighter, straight into the cockpit from behind. In the P-39, the round slammed into the Allison engine instead. The engine died, started smoking, but Golubev was alive. He put the nose down, used gravity and the P-39's weight to build speed, made it 8 miles to Soviet lines before belly landing in a wheat field. The farmer who pulled him from the wreck couldn't believe he'd survived. The back of his seat looked like Swiss cheese. Every round had been stopped by the engine block. The cannon itself was a marvel of destruction. The M4 37mm fired shells that weighed 1.5 pounds, leaving the barrel at 2,000 feet per second. American pilots complained it was too slow firing, only 3 rounds per second. They preferred the reliability of 650 caliber machine guns. Soviet pilots, who'd been fighting with weapons that sometimes had no ammunition at all, thought the Americans were insane. 3 rounds per second of shells that could destroy a tank? That could tear the wing off a bomber with one hit? The P-39 also carried 2 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 4 30 caliber guns in the wings. But Soviet pilots often had the wing guns removed to save weight. Who needed them when you had the hand of God in your nose? The Germans developed specific tactics for fighting P-39s, which itself was an admission of respect. Stay high, they told new pilots. Never follow a Kabrushka below 3,000 feet. If you see one climbing, that's your chance. They climb like a brick. But if one gets on your tail low, dive straight for the ground and pray. They can't follow you in a power dive past 400 miles per hour. The controls lock up. Of course, pulling out of a 400-mile-per-hour dive at low altitude had its own problems, but it was better than taking a 37mm shell in your engine. Major Hans Kruger from Munich had 28 kills when he encountered his first P-39 in February 1943. He was leading a swarm of 4 Bf-109s, escorting Stukas hitting Soviet tank concentrations. The P-39s came from nowhere, not from above, where fighters were supposed to attack, but level fast out of the forest. The first pass destroyed 2 Stukas. Kruger rolled, tried to engage, but the P-39s were already gone, using their speed to extend, setting up another run. It was like fighting someone who refused to follow the rules. When he finally got one in his sights, climbing desperately for altitude after a strafing run, he understood why the Russians loved them. Even climbing, even slow, the P-39 was stable, predictable. The pilot, instead of fighting his plane, was looking back at him, timing his brake perfectly. When Kruger fired, the P-39 simply rolled left and dove. By the time Kruger followed, the Russian was gone, lost in the ground clutter. The teacher from Minnesota who'd designed the P-39, Robert Woods, probably never imagined his plane's greatest success would come in Russian hands. Bell Aircraft had pitched it to the Army as a high-altitude interceptor. The prototype had been beautiful, fast, with a turbo supercharger for high-altitude performance. Then the Army got involved. They wanted more armor, more guns, self-sealing fuel tanks. The weight went up by nearly 1,000 pounds. The turbo supercharger was deleted to save money and complexity. By the time it entered service, it was a completely different aircraft, too heavy to climb, too slow at altitude, dangerous in certain flight regimes. American pilots in the Pacific quickly switched to P-38s and P-40s. The British took a shipment, flew them once, and demanded their money back. But the Soviets? They stripped out the unnecessary equipment. Radios that didn't work with Soviet frequencies? Gone. The heavy .30 caliber wing guns? Removed. Some pilots even had the armor plate behind the seat taken out. The engine was armor enough. They replaced American oxygen systems with simpler Soviet ones or removed them entirely. Who needs oxygen when you never fly above 10,000 feet? Every pound saved meant better performance where it mattered. A stripped P-39 could do 350 miles per hour at sea level, faster than anything Germany had at low altitude. The mechanic from Detroit, Staff Sergeant James Morrison, was one of the few Americans who went to Russia to train Soviet ground crews on P-39 maintenance. He couldn't believe what he saw. Soviet mechanics working in 40 below weather, using hammers to fix delicate instruments, somehow keeping planes flying that should have been grounded. They had no proper tools, no heated hangars, often no replacement parts. They made gaskets from leather, hydraulic lines from captured German equipment, cannon shells from melted-down church bells. Morrison watched a Russian crew chief fix a damaged propeller blade with a piece of railroad track and a blowtorch. The repair held for 60 combat missions. The cold that Morrison found unbearable was another P-39 advantage on the Eastern Front. The Allison engine, finicky in the Pacific heat, loved the cold. It ran better at 20 below than at 90 degrees. The liquid cooling system that American pilots worried about, one bullet in the radiator and you're done, rarely froze if you kept the engine running. Soviet pilots learned to never ever shut down completely. Even at night, even under camouflage, one man would start each engine every 2 hours, run it for 5 minutes, keep the oil from turning to sludge. In the morning, when German planes struggled to start in the cold, the P-39s were ready. Lieutenant Nikolai Levitsky from Smolensk discovered another advantage by accident. The P-39's tricycle landing gear, with a nose wheel instead of a tail wheel, was another thing American pilots initially mocked. Real fighters had tail wheels. But in Russia, operating from dirt strips, snow-covered fields, sometimes just frozen rivers, that nose wheel was a godsend. The plane was easier to taxi, easier to control on the ground, less likely to ground loop and kill you before you even got airborne. Levitsky had to land on a frozen lake after engine damage, something that would have been suicide in a tail dragger. The P-39 handled it like it was designed for ice landing. He took off from the same lake the next morning after his mechanic fixed the engine with parts from a captured German truck. The greatest day for P-39s on the Eastern Front came during the Battle of Kursk, July 12, 1943. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, their last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe put up everything they had, nearly 2,000 aircraft. The Soviets met them with everything they had, including 3 Guards regiments flying P-39s. The battle over Prokhorovka was the largest tank battle in history, but above it was perhaps the largest concentrated air battle of the war. In 8 hours of continuous fighting, P-39s flew over 300 sorties, mostly ground attack, against German armor. Captain Kirill Yevstigneyev from Moscow led 12 P-39s against a formation of 87 Stukas escorted by Bf-109s. Traditional tactics would have said, hit the fighters first, then go after the bombers. Yevstygneyev ignored tradition. His P-39s punched straight through the fighter screen, taking losses, accepting damage to get at the Stukas. The 37mm cannons turned the dive bombers into flaming wreckage. One shell could cut a Stuka in half. In 4 minutes, they destroyed 17 dive bombers. The German tank crews below, counting on air support, watched their Stukas rain down like burning snow. The numbers from that day still seem impossible. Soviet records claim 334 German aircraft destroyed. German records admit to 159 lost. The truth was somewhere between, but either number was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. They never recovered. Many of those kills came from P-39s, flying low, using their weight and firepower, refusing to be drawn into high-altitude battles they couldn't win. One Soviet pilot, his ammunition exhausted, rammed a German bomber with his P-39's reinforced nose. Both planes went down, but the Soviet pilot survived, pulled from his crashed plane by tank crews who'd watched the whole thing. The farm boy from Iowa, Lieutenant Donald Lopez, was one of the few American pilots who successfully flew the P-39 in combat, with the 35th Fighter Group in New Guinea. He had to unlearn everything he'd been taught in flight school. Don't climb to engage. Don't try to turn fight a zero. Use your speed, use your firepower, use your dive performance. One pass and extend. He watched Russian combat films, studied their tactics. In 6 months, he had 5 confirmed kills, all using Soviet-style tactics. When he rotated home and tried to teach these methods, he was ignored. American doctrine was American doctrine. The P-39 was a failed design. The fact that Russians were becoming aces in it was dismissed as propaganda. But the Germans knew better. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1943 show growing concern about P-39s. Not fear. German pilots were too proud for that, but respect. The reports note the aircraft's effectiveness below 3,000 meters, its devastating firepower, the skill of Soviet pilots in employing it. One captured German pilot, Major Friedrich Beck, told his interrogators that P-39s had changed the air war on the Eastern Front. They weren't fighting by the rules anymore. They came in low and fast, hit hard, and disappeared. By the time you reacted, they were gone, and your wingman was falling in flames. The psychological effect was significant. German bomber crews began refusing missions without massive fighter escort when P-39s were reported in the area. The sound of that 37mm cannon, a distinctive boom rather than the chatter of machine guns, became known as Stalin's hammer. Tank crews especially feared P-39s. The plane could destroy a Panzer IV with a single well-placed shot through the thin top armor. Even Tigers weren't safe. The 37mm couldn't penetrate their frontal armor, but from above, diving at 45 degrees, it was lethal. Senior Lieutenant Arseny Vorozhkin from Gorky perfected the anti-tank technique. Dive at 45 degrees, fire at 300 yards, one shell, pull out at 50 feet. He destroyed 6 tanks in one day during the retreat from Orel. His mechanic painted tank silhouettes on his fuselage next to the aircraft kills. By war's end, he had 46 aircraft and 18 tanks. He said the P-39 was like a flying artillery piece. You didn't dogfight in it, you hunted in it. The cost was brutal. P-39's flying ground attack took horrific losses. German flak was murderous at low altitude. For every pilot like Pokryshkin who survived to become an ace, 5 died in their first 10 missions. The life expectancy of a P-39 pilot on the Eastern Front was about 30 combat missions, but the Soviets kept requesting more P-39s through Lend-Lease. Of the 9,558 P-39s built, 4,746 went to the Soviet Union, more than half of all production. They wanted everyone Bell could make. The relationship between Soviet pilots and their P-39s was almost mystical. They gave them names, painted them with personal insignias, talked to them like living things. Captain Ivan Babak from Kiev called his P-39 Masha after his wife. He claimed the plane saved his life 17 times, counted each incident, wrote them in a notebook. When Masha was finally shot down in January 1944, too damaged to repair, Babak cut out the piece of fuselage with the name painted on it, carried it for the rest of the war. There was a practical reason for this attachment. In the Soviet Air Force, a pilot who lost his plane might not get another. Aircraft were precious, so pilots and their ground crews did everything to keep their P-39s flying. They cannibalized wrecked planes, German planes, even trains for parts. They flew with damage that would have grounded any American aircraft. Bullet holes were patched with canvas and glue. Damaged control surfaces were rebuilt with wood from ammunition crates. Oil leaks were fixed with soap and prayer. Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Bond, U.S. Army Air Force's liaison officer in Russia, filed a report in September 1943 that nobody in Washington wanted to hear. The P-39 was not a failure. In the right conditions, with the right tactics, flown by pilots who understood its strengths, it was deadly effective. The Soviets weren't succeeding despite the P-39's flaws. They were succeeding because they ignored American doctrine and developed their own. Bond recommended studying Soviet tactics, maybe even adopting them for low-altitude operations. The report was filed and forgotten. The U.S. was already moving on to P-47s and P-51s. But in Russia, the P-39 fought on. Through the mud of autumn 1943, the snow of winter, the thaw of spring 1944. Each phase of the war brought new challenges and new tactics. During the Wehrmacht's retreat, P-39s hunted the columns of vehicles streaming west. One pass could destroy a dozen trucks, create roadblocks that trapped entire divisions. The cannon was perfect for this work. One shell in a fuel truck turned it into a bomb. The carpenter from Volgograd, Sergeant Mikhail Baranov, kept count of everything his squadron destroyed in their P-39s during the pursuit through Ukraine. Not just planes, 234 trucks, 89 artillery pieces, 12 locomotives, 31 tanks, one bridge, took 8 planes and all their ammunition, and somehow 3 submarines caught on the surface in the Black Sea. The 37mm cannon could punch through a submarine's pressure hull. Who knew? As the Soviets pushed west, the P-39 revealed another advantage. It was simple enough to maintain in primitive conditions, but sophisticated enough to compete with late-war German aircraft. The new FW-190D and late-model Bf-109G were superior at altitude, but the air war over the Eastern Front remained a low-altitude knife fight. Polish partisans reported watching a battle where 6 P-39s engaged 12 German fighters at treetop height. The Germans couldn't use their vertical tactics without hitting the ground. The P-39s, heavy and stable, picked them apart in the horizontal. 4 German planes down, no Soviet losses. The greatest P-39 ace, Alexander Pokryshkin, developed what became known as the Pokryshkin's formula: height, speed, maneuver, fire. But it was different from Western doctrine. Height meant 3,000 feet, not 20,000. Speed meant maximum velocity at low altitude. Maneuver meant one sharp turn, not a prolonged dogfight. Fire meant one burst from the cannon, not spraying ammunition. He taught this to dozens of pilots. Many became aces themselves. The Germans put a specific price on his head, 100,000 Reichsmarks, to any pilot who shot him down. In March 1944, Captain Georgy Kostelev from Odessa demonstrated what a P-39 could do in the right hands. Jumped by 6 Bf-109s while alone, out of ammunition from a previous ground attack, he should have been dead. Instead, he used the P-39's weight and stability to outdive them, pulling out at literally ground level. His propeller kicked up dust. The Germans followed but pulled out higher. Kostelev led them on a chase through a valley, using the P-39's superior low-altitude speed. 2 Germans hit the valley walls trying to match his turns. The others gave up. Kostylev landed with no ammunition, almost no fuel, and 186 bullet holes in his aircraft. The mechanic counted them twice, couldn't believe the plane still flew. The P-39's unusual layout saved lives in unexpected ways. Lieutenant Pavel Golovachev from Minsk discovered this when a German 20mm shell exploded inside his cockpit. In any normal fighter, he'd have been shredded. But the P-39's drive shaft housing, running under his seat, deflected most of the shrapnel downward. He lost both feet but survived, managed to fly the damaged plane 60 miles to base, landed it perfectly despite having no rudder control. He was flying again with prosthetics 3 months later. The Germans who heard this story thought it was propaganda. It wasn't. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front was essentially broken. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and industrial bombing had reduced them to a shadow. But P-39s kept flying, now often without opposition. They became pure ground attack aircraft, flying artillery for the advancing Soviet armies. During the Vistula-Oder offensive, P-39s flew in weather that grounded everything else. Snow, fog, freezing rain, conditions that would have stopped American operations cold. The Allison engine, properly maintained, properly understood, kept running. Captain Viktor Talalikin from Bryansk flew his P-39 for 14 months straight without an engine overhaul. His mechanic, a former railroad engineer, had figured out how to adjust the engine to run on the low-grade fuel they often had to use. Captured German fuel, alcohol, once even vodka, mixed with aviation fuel when they were desperate. The engine knocked, smoked, ran rough, but it ran. In those 14 months, Talalikin flew 341 combat missions, destroyed 27 aircraft, uncounted ground targets. When they finally replaced the engine, they cut it open to see why it hadn't died. Every bearing was worn past tolerance, the cylinder walls were scored, the valves were burned. It should have ceased 100 flights ago. The respect between P-39 pilots and their opponents was sometimes remarkable. In February 1945, Major Vasily Drygin from Rostov shot down what turned out to be one of Germany's last operational jet fighters, and Me-262, the German pilot survived, was captured. When he learned he'd been shot down by a P-39, he demanded to see the aircraft. He couldn't believe it. A jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, shot down by a plane the Americans considered obsolete. Drygin explained he hadn't tried to dogfight the jet. He'd waited in clouds near the German airfield, caught the Me-262 on approach, slow, gear down. One burst from the 37mm into the engine. Even jet engines couldn't survive that. The final months of the war saw P-39s over Berlin itself. Not many. By then, newer Soviet fighters were taking over, but the veterans in their battered Kobrushkas were there. Pokryshkin flew his last combat mission in a P-39 on May 8, 1945, shooting down a German fighter that apparently hadn't heard the war was ending. It was his 59th confirmed kill in the P-39. He'd been offered newer planes many times, LA-7s, Yak-3s, even captured German fighters. He always refused. The P-39 had kept him alive through 600 combat missions. Why change now? The numbers tell the story of the P-39 on the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots flying P-39s claimed over 4,000 aircraft destroyed, thousands of tanks, uncounted ground targets. The top Soviet ace, Ivan Kozhedub, flew P-39s for his first 45 kills before transitioning to the LA-7. 5 of the top 10 Soviet aces flew P-39s as their primary mount. These weren't propaganda figures. Soviet kill confirmation requirements were stricter than American or British standards, often requiring physical evidence or ground witness confirmation. After the war, captured German records confirmed what Soviet pilots had claimed. The P-39 had been one of their most dangerous opponents, not at high altitude, not in classic fighter combat, but down low in the brutal, grinding war where tanks and infantry decided battles. A Luftwaffe analysis from April 1945 listed the P-39 as one of 3 Soviet aircraft that had significantly impacted operations, the others being the Il-2 Sturmovik and the Yak-3. The American reaction to Soviet P-39 success was mostly embarrassment. How could the plane they'd rejected, mocked, called the Iron Dog and the Pea-Shooter become the mount of Soviet aces? The answer was simple but hard for American doctrine to accept. There was no such thing as a universally bad aircraft, only aircraft used incorrectly. The P-39 was perfect for the Eastern Front. Low altitude, short range, ground attack, cold weather, everything the Americans saw as flaws, the Soviets saw as features. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who became an American ace in P-47s, flew a captured P-39 in 1946 to understand what the Soviets saw in it. His report was revealing. Below 10,000 feet, properly loaded, the P-39 was magnificent. Stable gun platform, excellent visibility, responsive controls. The 37mm cannon was devastating when you learned to use it. The tricycle gear made landing easy. The car door made emergency exit simple. Everything Americans complained about made sense when you stopped trying to make it something it wasn't. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from Alexander Pokryshkin himself, interviewed years after the war. Asked why he loved the P-39 when Americans hated it, he laughed. Americans wanted a racehorse that could run at any altitude, any distance. We needed a warhorse that could pull artillery and step on enemies. The P-39 was our warhorse. Ugly, bad-tempered, but it did what we needed. It killed Germans. What else matters? The legacy of the P-39 on the Eastern Front goes beyond numbers. It proved that technology alone doesn't win wars. Adaptation does. The Soviets took an unwanted American design and made it legendary through sheer pragmatism. They ignored doctrine, ignored design specifications, ignored everything except results. When German pilots learned to fear the distinctive shape of the P-39, when tank crews scattered at the sound of that 37mm cannon, when Soviet aces chose it over newer designs, it proved something important. There are no bad weapons, only bad applications. The P-39 continued serving in the Soviet Air Force until 1949, long after the Americans had scrapped theirs. Some were converted to trainers, teaching new pilots the skills they'd need for jet fighters. The weight, the responsiveness, the need for precise flying, all prepared pilots for the next generation. Veterans who'd flown P-39s in combat became the core of Soviet jet fighter development. They understood something American pilots had missed. Sometimes the wrong design teaches the right lessons. In the 1960s, a Soviet aviation museum tried to restore a P-39 for display. They found one in a farmer's field in Ukraine where it had crash-landed in 1944. The farmer had been using it as a chicken coop for 15 years. When they examined it closely, they found something remarkable. The engine, despite 15 years of weather and chickens, was largely intact. With minimal restoration, they got it running. The Allison V-1710, the engine Americans considered problematic, had survived Russian combat, a crash landing, and 15 years of neglect. It ran for another 10 minutes before they shut it down, afraid to damage their only complete example. Today, only a handful of P-39s survive worldwide. Most are in museums, static displays of a failed design. But in Russia, they're displayed differently, not as failures, but as heroes. At the Central Air Force Museum in Monino, a P-39 sits among the greatest Soviet aircraft of the war. The placard doesn't mention that Americans rejected it. It lists the aces who flew it, the battles it won, the Germans it killed. School children learn about Pokryshkin's white P-39, the way American children learn about Jaeger's X-1. The story of the P-39 on the Eastern Front is ultimately about perspective. The Americans, looking up at 30,000 feet preparing for strategic bombing, saw a failure. The Soviets, looking at German tanks crushing their villages, saw salvation. The same aircraft that embarrassed Bell Aircraft became the chariot of Soviet aces. The same engine that overheated in the Pacific ran perfectly in Russian winter. The same cannon that Americans called too slow firing, Russians called the hand of God. Perhaps the final word should go to Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated German pilot of the war, who survived the Eastern Front. Asked about Soviet aircraft, he said the Il-2 was dangerous, the Yak-3 was excellent, but the P-39 was personal. When you saw those shark's teeth painted on the nose, that big cannon poking out, you knew the pilot inside wasn't playing by anyone's rules. He was there to kill you, altitude be damned, energy tactics be damned. They came at you like guided missiles with a human brain. We learned to fear them, then respect them, then avoid them when possible. The German pilots who laughed at the P-39 in 1942 weren't laughing by 1943. By 1944, they were actively avoiding engagement with them below 10,000 feet. By 1945, when Pokryshkin's white P-39 appeared over Berlin, it was a symbol of Soviet air supremacy. The failed American design had become one of the most successful fighter aircraft on the Eastern Front. Not through superior technology, not through perfect design, but through adaptation, desperation, and the simple recognition that in war, you use what works. The P-39's success in Soviet hands remains one of the great ironies of World War II. The plane Americans wouldn't fly became the mount of Soviet aces. The design Bell aircraft apologized for became the terror of the Wehrmacht. The 37mm cannon that was too slow destroyed more German armor than most dedicated tank destroyers. It's a reminder that in warfare, context matters more than specifications. The P-39 wasn't a bad aircraft. It was just fighting the wrong war in American hands. In Soviet hands, fighting their war, their way, it was exactly what they needed. The last confirmed kill by a P-39 in Soviet service came on August 19, 1945, during the invasion of Manchuria. Lieutenant Boris Safonov from Murmansk shot down a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft over Korea. It was an almost casual kill. One burst from the 37mm, the Japanese plane disintegrated. Safonov had 41 previous kills, this last one coming after Germany had surrendered after the atomic bombs, after everyone thought the war was over, was somehow fitting. The P-39 had started the war as a joke and ended it still killing enemies. The Eastern Front claimed millions of lives, destroyed entire nations, rewrote history. In that apocalyptic struggle, the P-39 played a role nobody expected. It proved that determination matters more than design, that adaptation beats doctrine, that the wrong tool in the right hands becomes the right tool. Every German pilot who died to that 37mm cannon, every tank destroyed by diving P-39s, every Soviet pilot who became an ace in an inferior aircraft proved the same point. In war, only results matter. Years later, Bell aircraft engineers visited the Soviet Union, saw how their failure had become legend. They were shown kill boards, victory tallies, grateful letters from ground troops saved by P-39 strikes. One engineer, looking at Pokryshkin's restored P-39, said he finally understood. They'd designed a high-altitude interceptor. The Soviets had recognized a low-altitude destroyer, same plane, different vision. The difference was 20,000 feet and several thousand German aircraft. The story ends where it began, with laughter. But not German laughter at the strange American design, Soviet laughter. In May 1945, as their P-39s flew victory parades over liberated cities. The plane nobody wanted had helped win the war nobody expected to survive. The 37mm cannon that was too big, too slow, too heavy, had punched through German armor, German aircraft, German confidence. The backwards design with its engine in the wrong place had carried Soviet pilots through the worst war in human history and brought them home. Today, when aviation historians discuss the P-39, they talk about two different aircraft. The American P-39, overweight, underpowered, dangerous, and the Soviet P-39, deadly, effective, beloved. Same plane, same engine, same cannon. The only difference was who flew it, where they flew it, and why they flew it. The Germans who faced it learned that difference the hard way, one 37mm shell at a time, until their laughter turned to fear, their fear to respect, and their respect to defeat. The P-39 Airacobra remains the ugly duckling that became a swan, but only after flying 5,000 miles east into a different war with different rules. It's a reminder that failure and success are often matters of perspective, timing, and application. The American pilots who refused to fly it were right for their war. The Soviet pilots who loved it were right for theirs. And the German pilots who died to that 37mm cannon, they learned that sometimes the joke is on you, and sometimes the punchline is lethal. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like, and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.